Okay, good afternoon. Can everyone hear me clearly? All right. So I just like to introduce myself. I am Sir Percival Peña Reyes. I am a faculty member of the Department of Economics of Ateneo de Manila University, and also the current director of the Ateneo Center for Economic Research and Development. So I would just like to share my screen and go through our preliminaries for this event. Right. So welcome to the ASERD seminar series. And there are some house rules that I would like to go through. And First point here, okay, we will let the speaker finish his presentation first before we entertain questions. Okay, Zoom participants, you are requested to stay muted and to stop sharing your video during the duration of this presentation. During question and answer, please virtually raise your hand and wait to be acknowledged. You may unmute and show yourself when asking your questions. And participants on Facebook, please post your questions in the comments section. Okay? Slides, videos, and other materials from the seminar are posted on our website only when the speaker gives his consent for sharing them. Okay? So I would like to take this opportunity now to introduce our esteemed guest, our speaker, Dr. Chetan Gate. Okay? Chetan Gate, PhD, is the director of the Institute of Economic Growth in New Delhi. He is also a professor of economics in the Economics and Planning Unit, Indian Statistical Institute, or ISI, in Delhi since 2003. He received his PhD in economics from Claremont Graduate University, California in 1999. He completed his MA in economics from the Delhi School of Economics in 1995. His research focus is in the fields of macroeconomics, monetary economics, economic growth and development, and the Indian macroeconomy. In 2014, he was awarded the Mahalanobis Memorial Gold Medal given to the best research economist in India under the age of 45. Chetan has held several visiting faculty positions in India and abroad and has been closely involved with the Reserve Bank of India in an advisory capacity. He was a member of the Reserve Bank of India's first Monetary Policy Committee until October 2020. From 2012 to 2013, he was the Reserve Bank of India Chair Professor in Macroeconomics at ICRIER, based in New Delhi. From February 2013 to September 2016, he was a member of the Technical Advisory Committee for Monetary Policy at the Reserve Bank of India. In September 2013, served as a member of the Expert Committee to revise and strengthen the monetary policy framework. Chetan chairs the Academic Advisory Board of the Reserve Bank of India Academy and serves on the editorial board of the RBI Occasional Paper Series. Chetan is a member of the Advisory Committee of the National Account System in the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation. He is also an external affiliate of the Center for Research in Macroeconomics and Macrofinance at Swansea University in the United Kingdom. He is a member of the Macrofinance Society. Okay, so without further ado, I would like to turn the virtual floor over to our guest, Dr. Chetan Gate. Dr. Gate, please.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Great. Well, thank you, Professor Sir Percival, very much for your kind introduction. very happy to give this talk at the Ateneo de Manila Economics Department. I should add that many moons ago, I used to live in the Philippines. In fact, I went to school in the Philippines. And one of my classmates from IS Manila, Lara Tahanera, is probably also attending this seminar. And I also want to thank Professor Alvin Ang, who I communicated with a little bit about giving talks in various venues. This is joint research with Ojasvita Behl, who's a PhD student of mine, and Devdullah Malik, who's a professor of economics at Deakin University. And the title of the talk is Redistributive Policy Shocks and Monetary Policy with Heterogeneous Agents. So it's a bit of a mouthful, so let me give you the broad motivation of what the paper is about. So governments in emerging market economies regularly intervene in their agricultural sectors, and even in developed countries this happens. And when developed countries were developing countries, there was the governments intervened in the agricultural sector, and whether it was in the name of ensuring food security, enhancing the income level of farmers, or supply side chain disruptions, which leads to volatile food prices, and therefore governments come in with procurement and redistributive motives to stabilize food prices. So there are a variety of ways through which governments intervene in the agricultural sector in the name of welfare, in the name of price stabilization, in the name of doubling farmer income, for instance, in the case of India recently. So this is well documented and well known. But the one particular intervention that we want to focus on is procurement and redistribution of food commodities. So governments typically in developing countries, and in India specifically, procure grain from the open market, and they have buffer stock norms. They meet their buffer stock norms, but they also have a food policy which redistributes procured grain to the poor. So if you're poor in India and also in many other countries, developing countries, you get subsidized food, which comes from this procurement process. So the redistributive policy shock refers to the procurement and redistribution of food commodities to the poor in the title. And these shocks occur at a high frequency enough for us to think about what their macroeconomic effects are on inflation, on welfare, on all kinds of sectoral flows of resources. And this is a nice research area to be in. DSG models are the frontier of research for business cycles everywhere, but new gains in DSG models for EMEs are also, there are quite a lot now, but the ones that focus on dual labor markets, monetary transmission when you have large informal sectors, monetary transmission when there are agricultural sector distortions, because you want to understand how food inflation is affecting sectoral flows and so on, is an exciting area to be in. So this is kind of the broad area that I am going to be basing this talk on. Now, India, I'll just briefly describe the Indian case. So in India, there's something called an Essential Commodity Act, which lists 23 agricultural commodities, which the government is tasked to procure at a price that is determined by a committee. It's called the Committee of Agricultural Cost and Prices. So prior to the planting season, the committee figures out the costs of cultivation and then gives a markup on that cost to farmers. And if farmers are registered through the procurement system, then they can actually sell, in theory, these commodities to the government at large wholesale markets and get this minimum support price. And the difference between what the government pays in terms of its minimum support price and then the price it basically off-takes it to the poor is the subsidy that it has to bear. And the organization in India that does this is called the FCI, that's called the Food Corporation of India. And if you look at the blue bar is the amount of, this is in rupees crore, by the way. So crore has 6 zeros in it. So this is the blue bar is basically the subsidy burden being picked up by the Food Corporation of India. And the green line is when states on top of the minimum support price announced by the central government may want to further incentivize farmers either politically or they feel that further incentives are needed for particular commodities, and they may add on something on top of the minimum support price. So that's the state. The green line is the state part of the food subsidy, but the orange line gives you what the subsidy burden is on food as a percentage of gross value added in crops. So what you can see is that it's fairly jaggedy. And in 2021, in COVID, so COVID started in March 20, more or less around the world, and until March 2021, things were really bad. You see a huge spike up in the food subsidy because there was more procurement, there was more redistribution, and so on. In fact, in India, one of the stimulus ways in which redistribution happened to COVID was there was a enhancement, a doubling of the food subsidy under the National Food Security Act during COVID to the poor. So that's why you see this very large increase in the orange line. So that's the food subsidy as a percentage of GDP in crops. And what we're interested in is, what is the macroeconomic effect of that, essentially that orange line? How is that impacting inflation, and how should central banks think about erratic changes in the food subsidy, which are driven by procurement and redistribution motives? That's essentially the research question. Now, this also pertains to the Philippines. There was a rice crisis of 2008, and in 2008, the Philippines government increased its allocation to Jinintuang Masaganang Ani by close to tenfold. And so just the subsidy burden on one commodity, rice, increased from 0.06% to 0.8% of GDP, which is quite large. The Indonesian government also doubled the amount of rice distributed through its Bulog program for all poor families in 2008. So the rice crisis of 2008 saw these kinds of interventions being made by Southeast Asian governments. India in 2013 passed a very ambitious food security program called the National Food Security Act. The National Food Security Act, India has a population of about 1.4 billion, 1.3 to 1.4, guarantees rice, wheat, and coarse grains at very low prices, 3 rupees per kilo. This is per member in a household per month. So 3 rupees for rice, wheat at 2, and coarse grains at rupees 1. So the dollar rupee exchange rate is roughly 80, I think 82. So you're getting these at 1 or 2 cents, or 1 or 2 or 3 cents, and that's your entitlement per person per month. And the National Food Security Act basically entitles about 2/3 of the entire population, close to 800 million people, at these subsidized. So this is a huge food security mission that guarantees subsidized grain to the poor. And then, as we know, response in many countries during COVID, because of the disruption in supply chains, one way in which the stimulus took place, and certainly this was the case in India, so this is the Prime Minister program for distributing free food to the poor. They got additional grain, they got a doubling of their existing entitlements, and there's a program called the One Nation, One Ration card. So, these were ration cards, are basically cards that the poor have, which they have to present to prove that they are eligible for the subsidized food grain. So there was an expansion on the extensive margin. There was expansion on the intensive margin. So this is a more durable way in which the subsidy took place. So what we're going to ask in this paper is, first of all, so central banks would want to know that when you have large food subsidy schemes, are these inflation, right? So that's a natural question to ask. And how do we think about this formally in terms of sectoral aggregate or aggregate inflation? So think about the sectoral inflation dynamics, and then think about the aggregate inflation dynamics. And then if the model is rich enough in the sense that it picks up on consumer heterogeneity, so we're going to have rich and poor households in the model, and on the supply side, if it's rich enough in terms of thinking about what's going on in the sectors, and we're going to have agriculture and manufacturing, how does consumer heterogeneity and the presence of two sectors interact to influence the impact of monetary policy changes to redistributive policy shocks? The government is going to basically increase the food subsidy by procuring and redistributing more. And if it's going to lead to inflation, the central bank is going to have to respond. So what is that going to mean for aggregate inflation, for output caps, for sectoral output caps, for sectoral employment flows? And then finally, the question is whether, what's going to happen to welfare? Do these central bank responses, which respond to food subsidy shocks, actually raise welfare? Do they reduce welfare? And why? And the second part of this research agenda is to address, should not only the Reserve Bank of India, but maybe the BSP or other central banks. There's an active debate in the academic literature whether central banks should target core inflation or should they target headline inflation, because lots of times the mandate for central banks is given in terms of headline inflation, because that's a number that people can understand. That's a number that people see. But core inflation is sticky price inflation, and a lot of academic research suggests that central banks should essentially target the sticky price index or core inflation. But I think a broad methodological point that we make in our paper is that we really need to embed the dynamics of an agricultural sector when we're thinking about monetary policy responses to various shocks in emerging market economies. So these shocks could be coming from, the fiscal sector. They could be coming from, food subsidies. But to get a richer picture, you have to have a framework which interacts the demand side with the supply side to get a fuller sense of the welfare consequences of these interventions. I've done a little bit of work on multi-sector representative agent New Keynesian models. I won't talk about this in detail in the interest of time, but rank models are New Keynesian models which have one agent. So that's the kind of model you learn if you are taking a master's level or PhD level monetary economics class in Ateneo, and you're reading Ghali's book. And then there are two agent New Keynesian models. De Bertoldi and Ghali basically argue that, look, we would like to write down models with heterogeneous agents, but they're complicated, and two agents do a fairly good job in replicating the aggregate dynamics of inflation and output. And then in a different context, you have two sector tank models. These are models with tradables and non-tradable sectors. Ginn and Perroy do something similar to us. But what we're trying to do in our model is embed two production sectors, an agricultural sector and a manufacturing sector, into a model with two types of agents, rich and poor. And then in that environment, we want to study how redistributive policy shocks impact inflation. And we're going to compare the impact of redistributive policy shocks on inflation with monetary policy shocks and productivity shocks, just to see how the dynamics work out. And our model is broad enough and general enough to embed a variety of environments. So the one sector, one agent textbook case is Ghali chapter 3. The two sector, one agent case is Aoki's paper in JME in 2001, which is the rationale for why central banks should target core inflation. And then the one sector, two agent framework is the De Bertoldi and Ghali framework of 2018. And what we find is that redistributive policy shocks, first of all, they're going to generate inflation. So that's something we get, and we identify the mechanism through which that happens. Despite generating inflation, and despite central banks tightening monetary policy, can increase welfare, and I will identify the mechanism through which happens, and really what's important here is that household level heterogeneity. In other words, the fact that some households are rich and poor affects the consumption channel of monetary policy, right? And once again, methodologically, this is a very rich area now. Hank models are becoming very prominent in thinking about the distributive effects of monetary policy. And so we're looking at TANK. TANK just means two agents, so it's a simplification. But we're able to write down a tractable model and then understand the general equilibrium implications of these kinds of redistributive policy shocks. Okay, now I'm going to quickly run through a sketch of the model. The full model is, it's a working paper. It's up on my website. Please write to me if you want to have a copy of it. But I just want to give you a flavor of how the model is structured. So there are two agents. The rich agents are going to be Ricardian, they buy bonds, and the poor agents are going to be rule of thumb consumers. So they don't go through financial markets, right? So they're basically consuming their wage income. And that's one way through which agents are different, their access to financial markets. And the second way through which they are different, and this picks up on some empirical work in the context of India, is that they have different degrees of risk aversion. Okay, so the rich are going to assume to have a higher degree of intertemporal elasticity of substitution. They're more willing to substitute consumption intertemporally than the poor, right? So they'll have lower coefficient of relative risk aversion, so they will have a higher intertemporal elasticity of substitution. So those are the two ways in which rich and poor are different. Now, on the supply side, there are going to be two production sectors. The agricultural sector is going to be assumed to be flexible price and competitive. And then the manufacturing sector, just as in the standard New Keynesian literature, is going to be characterized by sticky prices. So there'll be Calvo price setting, manufacturing prices will be sticky, and firms in the manufacturing sector are going to be assumed to be monopolistically competitive, right? So that's just the standard Aoki setup in terms of thinking about the agricultural sector and the manufacturing sector. Now, on top of this, we're going to feature an explicit procurement and redistributive motive for the government. And the way that it's going to work is that the government is going to essentially lump sum tax the rich. It's going to procure grain with the units of final goods that it gets from taxing the rich, because remember, everything is in units of final goods. And then it's going to redistribute a fraction of what it procures to the poor for free. Okay? So a fraction means that it takes some of the procured grain, some of it goes to the poor for free, and some of it enhances the buffer stock. That's essentially what the government does. And the rich households are going to own the firms. They will supply labor to their own firms. And if they supply labor to their own firms, and these are monopolistically competitive, they have dividend income from the profits they earn, but they also have labor income because they work in their own firms. And the poor households will only supply labor to firms owned by the rich. So they don't own the firms, so they don't make dividend income, and their only income is labor income. So that's how we think about the differences between the rich and the poor households. Now, the problem that every agent solves is going to be given by this utility function. So in time period 0, both poor and rich agents maximize expected lifetime utility. They derive utility over a consumption index. So CK, K corresponds to either whether you're R or P or rich or poor, and they have disutility from working, right? So these are standard preferences. And the parametrization of the utility functions is given by 1 and 2. And again, these are standard. So this is a power function. This is just a standard isoelastic utility function. And both poor and rich can either work in the A or M sector. So it's not like the poor only work in the A sector and the rich work in the manufacturing sector. We allow the poor to move across sectors and the rich to move across sectors as well. Later on, we close off that to think about a short run case where there's no labor mobility, but I may not have time to talk about that, but that's the case it's talked about in the paper. So this is the preference side. Now, what is this CKT? CKT is a Cobb-Douglas aggregate of the agricultural good that the rich consumes and the manufacturing good that the rich consumes. So this is a Cobb-Douglas index of what the rich consumes. So it's going to consume both types of goods. There's just going to be one type of agricultural good, but there'll be infinitely many types of the manufacturing good. The manufacturing good is indexed by the parameter J. So there are J firms from 0 to 1. They're indexed over the unit interval 0, 1. And this is going to be the manufacturing consumption manufacturing index, CS index aggregator that both households consume. Okay, so both the rich and poor are consuming the agricultural good and the manufacturing good. Now, they maximize these utility functions subject to these constraints. So what is the rich's budget constraint? The rich spend money on the varieties of the different varieties of the manufacturing good. That's their expenditure of that. They buy the single variety. R is for rich, A is for agriculture. That's the price of the ag good. That's their expenditure. They buy bonds because they go through financial markets. They get interest on bonds. They work. That's their wage income. They pay lump sum taxes and they receive dividends from the firms they own. So this is going to be the rich's demand for the agricultural and manufacturing good. Any of you work in New Keynesian models, these equations will look very familiar to you because they're standard. And the price index for the rich is this variable PT over here. The poor get, by assumption, a constant fraction, lambda t, in every period to subsidized. So in other words, this is the poor's consumption of the agricultural good at time period t, and some fraction of that at time period t is subsidized, okay? So this, and that's the S there. That's the subsidized part of the poor's agricultural consumption. The superscript S there means the subsidized part of their agricultural consumption. So they're getting some rice for free and they're getting the rest of the rice from the open market that they have to purchase. That's what this equation says. O for open, that's their purchase of open market grain, that's their purchase of subsidized grain, and that's their total poor's consumption of the agricultural goods. So it's either bought from the open market or from the subsidized, what it receives from the subsidy. The poor don't invest in bonds, so there's no bond term here, but they buy manufacturing goods. And the fact they get some of their agricultural consumption for free means that their market purchases of of the agricultural good gets knocked down by this fraction lambda. So if they're getting 40% of their agricultural consumption subsidized, then their expenditure on open market purchases of the ag good is knocked down by 1 minus 0.4. So it becomes 0.6 of what they would otherwise be spending. And that's less than equal to their wage income. NP is their labor supply, WT is the wage. Now notice that because the poor are getting a subsidized price of the agricultural good, this becomes the relative price, the relevant price for them for their agricultural good decisions. And so the consumer price index for them essentially becomes this. I apologize for going fast, but in the interest of time, these are standards, but what you'll get is the demand functions for the poor's consumption of the agricultural good, the poor's consumption of the manufacturing good, and these are these delta P, 1 minus delta P are their kind of like their market purchases of these goods as a function of their total purchases. Okay. Now you get in these models an Euler equation, you get labor supply equations. Remember that what we've assumed is that the coefficient of relative risk aversion for the rich and poor are different. So sigma R is going to be lower than sigma P. As I said before, one way through which households are assumed to be different is that the rich have a lower coefficient of relative risk aversion. They're more willing to substitute consumption intertemporally. So that's going to have a bearing on their labor supply decisions for changes in the wage rate. That's the real wage. And so too for the poor. And there's some empirical evidence saying that these are dimensions in which the rich and poor are different. So we kind of pick it up in the modeling. A few more things. This is a two-sector model. So in two-sector models, you have to have the terms of trade, right? So the numerator is going to be the manufacturing good. And what we get with two-sector frameworks is the way that monetary policy is going to impact the general equilibrium of the economy is via the terms of trade. Okay, so when the government procures and redistributes grain in the interest of stabilizing agricultural commodity prices or in the interest of maybe doubling farmer income, whatever it is, it's going to have an impact on the terms of trade. And the terms of trade is going to float around in the model. And it's going to do interesting things. So part of this research enterprise is to kind of understand how the terms of trade is impacting everything. One way through which it impacts inflation is through this expression over here. When you don't have two sectors, you know that inflation is just driven by the manufacturing sector, right? The sticky price sector. But when you do have an agricultural sector, you get this additional term over here. Okay? This delta TT. This is just TT minus 1. So the terms of trade starts floating around in inflation. Government procurement means this. So the government procures, capital P superscript is for procurement, subscript is for poor. The government basically procures the agricultural good at time period T and then takes a fraction of this, phi T, and redistributes this to the poor. So what does the poor get? The poor gets mu R is the population of the rich, 1 minus mu R is the population of the poor. That's the poor population multiplied by the subsidy given to per poor person. So that's the total subsidy given to the poor, and that's the amount that is redistributed out of procurement. Okay? And the agricultural sector output is basically all agricultural goods consumed, right? Including the subsidized part, plus the part that goes to the buffer stock. So what is redistributed is phi or phi, and what is going into the buffer stock is 1 minus phi. That's the remaining fraction. So these two things account for all agriculture production. This is the shock structure. This is fairly common. The production function in the agricultural sector, I apologize for bad notation here. A is the level of technology. A subscript is agriculture. So this is confusing. Sorry for that. This is labor in the agricultural sector. And the shock processes are AR1. Remember, there are J varieties of the manufacturing goods, so the shock processes are again AR1. And then for the procurement and redistribution, we're going to start off by making life simple and say that there's some deviation from some amount of procurement going on, let's say log of YPA, and then this, the government may suddenly decide to procure more, and its motive for procuring more is to redistribute. Right? So it's also going to, there may be some amount of redistribution happening in the steady state, and it's going to increase the amount of redistribution it does in time period T, because there's a rise in the in the amount of redistribution it wants to do, captured by these error terms on these AR1 processes. This is just market clearing. I'll highlight one thing here is that now GDP is a function of, well, I mean, you would think GDP is a function of the agricultural sector and the manufacturing sector. But remember, they're a bit like apples and oranges, right? Because they're two different goods. So you have to apply terms of trade to get everything into the numeraire. So the way it works out is GDP ends up becoming becomes this expression. So any redistributive policy shock that the government decides to procure and redistribute the food commodity to the poor is going to impact the terms of trade. That's going to impact GDP. So changes in the terms of trade will drive GDP changes. And this is just the standard government budget constraint. If you're familiar with these models, again, I mean, the model is quite complicated because it has the supply side features in terms of multiple production sectors. It has a demand side features in terms of two types of agents, but it's still in the simple class of DSG models because the aggregate dynamics of the model are summarized by a dynamic IS equation, a Taylor rule which summarizes monetary policy, and a new Keynesian Phillips curve. Now, if you remember your monetary policy, this term here should look familiar to you. This is basically a very close variant of the DIS equation in Dali chapter 3. That, your output gap, that's what Y tilde T is, depends on the expected value of your output gap tomorrow, and then it depends negatively on the deviation between the real interest rate and the natural rate of interest. Natural rate of interest, by the way, is the interest rate corresponding to the flexible price allocation. And now you get all these other terms floating around, right? Which are all the other structural features of the economy, which you don't get in a richer framework. So the terms of trade also floats around. So you don't get this in a simple NK model. But because we have two sectors and two types of agents, you end up getting all these additional terms floating around. So the output gap dynamics are given by this equation. The central bank sets nominal interest rates based on last period's value, inflation, and the output gap. So this is just a Taylor rule. And then the supply side of the economy. So if you remember your monetary economics, inflation is this is the new Keynesian Phillips curve, is typically beta times expected value of pi t plus 1. So this is the forward-looking part of inflation influencing current inflation, right? So this is the rationale for why central banks want to influence inflationary expectations, because if they do, they actually end up affecting actual inflation, right? And then the output gap is a measure of slack in the economy. The higher the output gap, the more inflation there is, right? So the standard model just has these two terms. But now that we have this richer framework, we're going to have the terms of trade floating around in various shapes and forms with a bunch of other structural parameters. So the NKPC also gets enhanced. And then finally, before I get to some of the results, let me highlight that the richest consumption is going to be given by this equation here. This is called an Euler equation. It's fairly standard, right? So this is the part where the rich reduce their consumption because if the real interest rate is high, then the opportunity cost of consuming now is high because they could be saving in bonds, so they will cut back their consumption. The poor's consumption is given by this equation. The poor's consumption for a mathematical reason will depend on the richest consumption. The mathematical reason is that both the poor and richest population share constant fractions of total population. So this term starts floating around because of that assumption. But more importantly, the poor's consumption will also depend on the amount of procurement the government does and the amount of redistribution the government does. Remember, phi t is the amount of redistribution the government does. So the more that you give to them, the more they consume, the poor. And this is the terms of trade, PA over P. So if the terms of trade rises, if the price of the agricultural good rises relative to the manufacturing good, then there's going, and if this term here is positive, which it is going to be for the parameters that we have, you're going to have the terms of trade impacting consumption negatively. Higher agricultural price is going to impact the consumption of the poor negatively. So the full effect of the framework is now affecting poor consumption is going to be given by these three terms. And of course, if you just had one agent, then and you had no redistribution, this lambda would be 0. And if you had the same coefficient of risk aversion, these guys would just cancel to be 1, and you get C hat PT equals to C hat RT. You won't have this term because there's no redistribution, no procurement. And if you have one sector, you don't have the terms of trade. So this is a general way to think about the poor's consumption response to a redistributive policy shock, which influences the terms of trade. Okay, and that's what's going to drive the aggregate welfare results, the disparate responses that the poor and rich have to shocks. Whereas the richest consumption will be governed by this equation, the poor's consumption is going to be governed by this equation, and you're going to get very different effects based on how these two play out. I don't have time to talk about this, but in all macro models, a lot of sweat and toil and trying to pinning down some of these structural parameters, but we've happy to talk about this maybe in the Q&A, but these are things that we've calibrated from some of my earlier work. And then we and get from India as a large national sample survey. So we're able to get some of these from the various rounds of the national sample survey, which has major rounds every 5 years or so. And the last major round was 2011, so about 12 years ago. And then we borrow the Taylor rule parameters from a well-known source, and then we also estimate some of the procurement parameters and the shock processes by ourselves, but also borrow some from the literature. Okay, so now I want to run through how the model works in terms of, remember what the earlier question was. The earlier question was, how do redistributive policy shocks impact welfare, right? So I said, government intervention in the food sector plays out in many forms, but it also plays out in these procurement and redistributive forms. And central banks want to know what are their implications for inflation, and will inflation go up, will it not, and why, and should they therefore tighten, should they not? And if they do tighten, what will happen to welfare? Will consumption fall in the economy? That was the broad question. So I want to answer that in terms of the model that I've laid out, and in terms of the dynamics that play in from that story. Don't focus on the green line. The green line is basically the two-sector, one-agent framework of Aoki. Look at the red line, which is our model, which is the system of equations that I've just described to you in brief. So let's just take a classic supply side shock. So assume that the agricultural sector becomes more productive, either because there's good rainfall or there's new high yielding varieties or so on, right? So that there's a boost in the agricultural productivity, which is about 3% above its steady state value. So that's how you interpret the y-axis. 0.03 means 3%. So this is assumed to be a 3% increase in the steady state value of agricultural productivity. The first thing that does is that boosts boosts output, okay? And you have more supply, so inflation falls, right? The terms of trade is going to fall because you've got more output, the price level falls, the red line falls. And you also have, because the level of agricultural price falls, the agricultural inflation also falls, okay? Higher productivity in agriculture, lower agricultural inflation. That's straightforward. Now, what is the nominal wage? The nominal wage is equal to the value of the marginal product of labor in the agricultural sector, right? So that's AA times PA. AA has gone up, but PA has gone down. The net effect of both those things is that for this thing to still go up. So this red line goes up. So a 3% increase in the agricultural productivity relative to steady state raises nominal wages by something quite small, because remember, this is times 10 to the power minus 3, but it does go up. Now, because prices are sticky in these models, that leads to a rise in the real wage, right? So people are better off, their real wages are higher. If the real wages are higher, then they consume more, so aggregate consumption in the economy should go up. And they should enjoy more leisure, so employment in the economy should go down. Another way of thinking about why employment in the economy should go down is we know that when there's a higher real wage, that's going to bestow income and substitution effects. A higher real wage means more income, and more income means people want to cut back on labor supply. But a higher real wage also means that the opportunity cost of staying at home has gone up. So people will want to supply more labor. In this case, the parameters are such that the income effect dominates and aggregate employment falls. So you get this rise in the real wage. The economy has lesser employment. In Aoki's model, remember, there are no poor agents because these are just one agent models. And in our model, we have poor agents. Remember that they had a higher coefficient of relative risk aversion. So that induces them to want to enjoy more leisure. So you don't get this decline in Aoki's framework, but you get it in ours. Now, because the real wage has gone up, everybody wants to consume all the goods in the economy, which are the agricultural and manufacturing goods. That's going to push up demand for the manufacturing good and agricultural good. So manufacturing employment will rise because firms in the manufacturing sector are going to basically want to cater to this demand. But because there's a given amount of labor, you're going to therefore mean that to get this additional amount of labor to go up, you're going to have to pull out of the agricultural sector. So the productivity shock means that you're actually going to see a decline in agricultural employment. The terms of trade changes. Remember, I told you that output depends on the terms of trade plus the sectoral output levels. Aggregate GDP rises. The output gap is just the aggregate output level relative to the output level in the flexible price allocation. That goes up. Manufacturing inflation goes down. And this happens because, again, this is what we learned from two-sector models. If we just had a one-sector model and real wages went up, and we know that in the new Keynesian model, inflation is equals to the discounted current and expected future marginal cost of production, which is the real wage. That should mean it should go up. But we also have a decline in the terms of trade here. And the terms of trade now enters into the expression for manufacturing inflation. So you get this decline, and therefore you get this decline in aggregate inflation. So this big productivity shock leads to a decline, a small decline in aggregate inflation. Central banks worry about inflation. They cut the nominal interest rate, and that cuts the real interest rate because prices are sticky. From the richest consumption equation, there's intertemporal substitution. So they jack up their consumption, right? Not by much, but they do it. And the poor also jack up their consumption because the rich have increased their consumption. So if you remember in this equation over here, remember there's no procurement right now. There's a terms of trade effect, but because the rich have increased their consumption, the poor are going to increase their consumption. And this thing is falling. So this minus here is going to induce this to rise. So you're going to get the poor's consumption to rise. So, and that's consistent with the fact that aggregate consumption rises. So in this case here, you get an agricultural productivity shock leading to a rise in total consumption, and that leads to a rise in welfare. The central bank responds to lower inflation by cutting the nominal interest rate, and that kind of leads to this effect. But there's also terms of trade happening here, and these are not mechanisms you would pick up unless you wrote down models with a richer supply side sector. Let's contrast this with procurement. I apologize, I'm going so fast, but I hope you're getting a flavor of what I'm trying to do, and I'm happy to pick up on any of this in the Q&A. Now, to the crux of the matter, we said, well, what happens if they want to procure and redistribute? They want to buy more. They buy more at the market price, and then they give to the poor for free. So there's procurement, there's redistribution. Remember, in Aoki, there are no poor, so there's no redistribution to them. That's why the green line is flat. But because they get, in our model, more food of the food good for free, their demand for the open market amount of agricultural produce is less. So their demand is less, and therefore these are demand-driven models. So the production of agricultural output is less because they're getting this stuff for free. It's a demand-side shock, so that's going to induce the terms of trade to rise. That's going to lead to a rise in inflation. So this is the exact opposite of a productivity shock, where the terms of trade fell and agricultural inflation fell. Here it rises, and this guy rises too. But now that the price of the agricultural good has risen, you're going to get an increase in the nominal wage. Again, this is the value of the marginal product of labor in the agricultural sector. PA times AA, the productivity. AA has not changed, but PA has gone up, so you get a higher nominal wage.
Yes,
you get a higher real
sorry,
wage. Yeah, are we out of time?
Yeah, yes, unfortunately, sir, I'm sorry to cut you, but it's already
I'll wrap up. I'll wrap up in 1 minute.
In
1 minute.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Okay. So in this case, we get an increase in agricultural employment. We get an increase in aggregate consumption. I won't get into the details, but here you get a rise in aggregate inflation because you have a demand side shock. Central banks respond by raising the nominal interest rate. They raise the real interest rate, but here's what's different compared to the previous case. Because of this intertemporal elasticity of substitution, right, the rich are going to basically cut back their consumption because they have a higher real interest rate. And the poor are basically going to increase their consumption because they get more redistribute, more procurement, even though there's a rise in the terms of trade. So this is at the heart of the result, is that the poor's consumption increases by about 2% above steady state, and the richest consumption falls by some small amount. So you do get an increase in aggregate consumption. So you get the welfare enhancement. I don't have time to talk about the monetary policy shock, but a nominal interest rate shock induces a change in the terms of trade. It induces a change in the terms of trade, which is not something you typically expect monetary policy to do. But in our model, it does. And it leads to interesting employment dynamics here. And in this case, we look at all four models. And then finally, let me just say, so since I've run out of time, is that there are two contributions that we have here. One is the policy contribution. The policy contribution is that we need to really model the terms of trade shocks when we think about their impact on monetary policy. And these terms of trade can change because of a variety of interventions that governments do. But also methodologically, we have a way of writing down these models to see how they impact inflation in the economy. And then there are various extensions in the paper where we look at employment shares in the agricultural sector being high or low, and so on. But I won't talk about those there, and I'll just say thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Chetan. Okay. So let us just proceed with the program. Perhaps we can take this opportunity to take questions from the floor. Okay. So this is Q&A portion now, right? So
yeah.
Would anyone like to pose a question, please? Okay. You may do so. Please use the chat box for that. Or virtually raise your hand. And you may unmute yourself when asking your question. Anyone? All right, there's a question. Mr. CJ Castillo, please, would you like to pose your question? I think there's a question here from participant. Please unmute yourself and turn on your camera.
Yeah, sure. It's just a straightforward question. I was just wondering if all the parameters are calibrated or are they fitted to data?
They are now fitted to data. So we've done a systems Bayesian estimation. So, but in the version that I have up on my web page, it's essentially a calibration result. So we have all these structural parameters. Some we can actually use the expressions for them to pin down their values. Some we estimate from data. But in the most recent version of the paper, we've done a Bayesian system estimation and checked that the parameters are more or less very similar. So we've done both, but we're probably going to run with the Bayesian estimation when we revise the paper.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Chetan. Others, please, don't be shy. Okay, CJ again raised his hand.
Yeah, sorry, I have a lot of questions. No, not really a lot, but this is probably the last question. Impulse responses really tend to go back to the steady state over time. In the case of time series models, I think it's a natural property of time series that are non-stationary. In DSG models, is there an assumption of or rather stationary time series? In DSG models, is there an assumption that when you fit the model into data, your data set must exhibit stationarity? Is that like assumed in the model?
Well, the deviations are log deviations, right? So, for instance, in the procurement series, which we have annual data for the last 30, 35, 40 years, we have the mean of that series, and we're looking at deviations of the actual values from the mean. But even in the impulse response functions, remember we are looking at deviations from the steady state, and then we're also looking at right, the tilde variables are deviations from the flexible price allocations. So those lead to perturbations that that make variables rise and get you back to steady state. Although as I think what you're asking in your question is that there are lots of macro variables that are not necessarily may have unit roots, but they may have near unit roots. So they may actually show a lot of persistence, right? If they have unit roots, of course, they would be stationary. But if they have unit roots that are not one but close to one, they would actually show a lot of persistence. But we've estimated these parameters, and these parameters are not close to those values, and which is why you would get this convergence back to steady state. But it's still an interesting question whether even though you don't have a unit root, there's something in the system that is preventing a variable from going back to a steady state value because of the structure of the model. So for instance, manufacturing inflation goes back to its steady state value very slowly. Agricultural inflation goes back to its steady state value quite quickly. So that could also be driving the dynamics of the model is how the structure of the economy is set up. Did I answer your question?
All right.
Yes, thank you for your answer.
Okay. Maybe perhaps one more question before we
May I ask one question?
wrap up. Yes, please go ahead. Oleg, yes, please.
Yeah. So, do I understand correctly that the structure of demand, for instance, I don't know, increase in procurement, uh, it affects pricing in the agricultural sector only through some general equilibrium effects? I mean, so the model does not explore the effects that procurements can provide some, I don't know, insurance of stable demand for the products of the agricultural sector or some effects like this. So the model says that it does not matter who's buying and it matters only through some general equilibrium effects. Am I right? Or am I missing something?
Yeah, it's a demand shock. So it's an increase in the demand by the government for the agricultural good, which is inducing the price level to rise. I mean, you in theory you could have a government announce a procurement policy which would induce the farmer to produce that good because it knows it's going to be able to sell it at a minimum support price. So based on the price the government announces, farmers just end up producing rice or white or rice or wheat because there's a support price on it. But we're thinking about it more in terms of a demand shock that raises the demand for the good, and then of course it's redistributed back to the poor who get a quantity subsidy based on the policy in place. So that's the lambda variable. And then the difference between what they procure and what they're redistributing, of course, procuring at the market price and they're redistributing it for free, is the food subsidy. So that thing is going to change when you have a procurement and redistributive shock. And then the allocations that the poor and rich decide is going to change, and that's going to affect the general equilibrium of the model and the prices, so on. But it's really a demand shock. That's how we think about it.
Okay. I'm sorry, but we cannot. We have to stick to the time. Okay, so perhaps I can I can no longer accommodate questions, no? So I'll have to cut it here. Okay? And thank you very much again, no, Dr. Chetan, for very interesting presentation, and Oleg for your questions. And let me just share my screen to go through this. Okay, right. So I would like to invite everyone, take this opportunity to invite everyone to our next third seminar series presentation. This is care of Dr. Leonardo A. Lanzona Jr., professor in our dimensions of job polarization in the Philippines. So again, this will be via Zoom on April 12, 2022. That's a Wednesday at 10 a.m. Okay, so please keep a tab on that. And may I also invite everyone to visit our economics website. The address is shown here. So materials from previous seminars can be downloaded here. We also have a YouTube and Facebook channel where you can review our economic seminar videos. So I would like also to invite everyone, if in case of interest, if you'd like to visit, revisit these presentations panels. Okay. And those of you who would like to request a certificate, there is actually a request form for certificates. Okay, the request form will be open for a limited time only. Okay, please email us to request for a certificate. Emailing us rather to request for a certificate will not be entertained. So it is supposed to be done through this link. The certificates will only be given to those who attended via Zoom and who accomplished this request form. Okay. For those who successfully completed the request form, please wait for a scheduled release of the certificate. Okay. So again, thank you very much, everyone. I would like to take this opportunity now to call for a photo op. Okay. So if we could turn on our cameras, no? And Tweetums and Gerald. No? Gerard can, Rainier rather, Rainier can uh, take our photos. So please,
So just waiting for everyone to turn on their cameras. So
put on your best smile.
okay, 1, 2, 3. Another 1, 2, 3. Thank you so much.
Right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So it's already 5 o'clock, everyone. So again, thank you very much, Dr. Chetan, and all of our participants who took the time to learn, no, from this presentation. And of course, we would welcome seeing you again soon in our succeeding third seminar series presentations. Okay. So
Thank you so much. Thank you.
right. Thank you very much, sir, and everyone. So this brings uh, our activity to a close.
Bye.
Bye-bye, sir.